Third on the panel is Carolyn Egan. Won't be unknown to any of you, I'm sure. Carolyn is the president of the Steelworker Toronto Area Council, also co-chair of the Good Green Jobs Committee of the Good Jobs for All Coalition, and a member of the Labour Caucus of the Workers' Assembly, and a prominent activist in the long-term struggle for reproductive rights, for which I'd like to say personally thank you. A very important contribution that you've made.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be on the panel with the two brothers from Madison. I lived in Madison for a period of time during the Vietnam era before I emigrated here, and it was a happening place then in terms of political activism. And I'll say that the firefighters at that juncture were really militant. They linked with student activists and others in the anti-war movement. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on here and some of my thoughts about what's going on, I think, globally. And as we've heard from the two speakers before me, governments and corporations around the world are launching massive attacks on workers and the poor. And they're telling us we're all in it together, and that their measures are necessary to keep governments from going bankrupt, to keep corporations competitive. Certainly our members and steelworkers hear that all the time. But what's happening is not simply a question of cost trimming, cutting deficits, or bringing budgets into line. They want to use this opportunity to fundamentally change the nature of society and the role of the state. And there's no doubt in my mind that they're very, very determined, the ruling class, corporations, to fight this war down to the last drop of our blood. And the question that's being posed is why the working class and the poor, particularly women and racialized communities, should pay the cost when we did nothing to cause the crisis. Why not clamp down on businesses that have been breaking the law, using financial loopholes, continuing to make profits, giving massive bonuses to upper management? Why not nationalize banks and corporations and bring the profits into the public realm? All very legitimate questions. But the answer is that the attacks are not a pragmatic response to an economic crisis, as we're being told, but the implementation of an economic ideology intended to serve the wealthy, and that is bringing increased suffering, dislocation to working people and the poor everywhere. We're certainly seeing it in this city. The ruling class is also gambling that the anger from below that the two comrades just talked about can be contained. And we know that there's opposition to the attacks, as they were telling us, but they also said, and I think this is very important, the resistance is not automatic. Workers and the poor remain caught between fear and anger. We see this all the time in the steelworkers, wanting to fight, but feeling a pessimism that we can't win. And when we saw the recent vote in Toronto, the municipal election, where voters endorsed the right-wing candidate, Mayor Rob Ford, he had a simplistic message: stop the gravy train. He went on about elites at City Hall, waste, higher taxes, and it resonated with people who were scared of what the future might bring, fearful for their jobs and their ability to make ends meet, and being offered no real alternative. Change in the lives of ordinary Canadians over the last 30 years have swept away a lot of the old certainties, a process that's been very much accelerated in my mind by the recession, fear of the precariousness and instability of people's lives. Immigrants come to Canada with hopes of a better life, face systemic racism, growing gap between rich and poor. 100,000 manufacturing jobs have been lost in the GTA, many by racialized workers in the last few years. Prosperity for those who work hard, the foundation of the American or the Canadian dream for that matter, is in tatters as governments rescue the rich. And the polarization of social conditions and politics is very likely to continue as more and more are alienated from the political system. And the austerity agenda is being implemented worldwide, as we all know, and our local manifestation here in Toronto is becoming equally as harsh. Its attack on public services and unions, and anyone who's read the shock doctrine will recognize the approach. In response to any crisis, the champions of neoliberalism have a ready-made response: shrink public programs and government by cutting or privatizing public services, selling public assets, weakening public ability to regulate corporations, and of course, attack the working class through cuts in services to attacks on unions. Shift the cost of the crisis from the corporations and the wealthy to working people and the poor by cutting corporate taxes, increasing user fees, withdrawing from key areas of responsibility so people will have to buy services from private companies. And of course, reducing workers' wages by gutting labor laws, weakening unions, contracting out jobs, increasing precarious work, and reducing employment standards. If you contrast the treatment of working people who are losing our jobs, homes, unions, to the treatment of the culprits responsible for the financial meltdown we went through a few years ago. I mean, the Ford agenda encompasses this approach, taking away the right to strike from the amalgamated transit workers, who should have done a little bit more to fight back, doing away with the Toronto board of the Toronto Community Housing Corporations, and threatening to enrich landlords by privatizing public housing, contracting out garbage collection as they're promising. They're all just the start of attacks that we'll be seeing over the next period, and they're going to come hard and fast, as the brothers had said earlier. And the issue we're facing is whether the working class, the poor, our allies, can stop what's happening, whether we can build the resistance that's necessary. The neoliberals, in this town anyway, I believe are testing the waters, seeing how far they can go. They've gambled that the mass of the population will accept the attacks. But if we look worldwide, we're seeing it's not always the case. In Greece, Portugal, China, France, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and what we've heard tonight in Wisconsin, workers, students, marginally employed have risen up and fought back. Who will win and who will lose is an open question. But I think everyone in this room knows that workers have the potential to push back these attacks, but only if we're organized to do so. And we've seen tough fights here in Canada. The Valley Inco steelworkers were out for a year walking the line to save a defined pension plan for new hires. But they eventually bit the bullet and settled. As my friend Michelle says, lions being led by donkeys. Locked out Sears warehouse workers fought for 6 months up in Vaughan before the union urged them to accept the stand-pat agreement. There have been recent walkouts in the post office we've seen. And almost 2 years ago, and there's a lot of critique of what happened there, but municipal workers in Toronto fought against concessions for 2.5 months. We can talk about what happened in that strike. Now, U.S. Steel in Hamilton has taken on a militant and well-prepared local union in its attempt to de-index pensions and remove the defined pension plan for new hires. There's an activist leadership and a rank-and-file corps that's been preparing for this battle for years. It pits a multinational corporation against 900 workers and 9,000 retirees and widows, and a community organized behind them. Their fight is very much our fight, and what's going to happen is yet to be seen. It's tough, tough, tough. But in spite of all these localized fightbacks, there's been no broad mobilizations that we've seen in other places, as we did see during the Days of Action, as we saw in Wisconsin. But it could still come. And I think we have to look at what's going on right now in our city, and the fact that the labor movement is beginning to move. Labor movement and community organizations have started a campaign against the Ford attacks. And I think tomorrow's mobilization that you've all been preparing for, doing the signs, etc., is to be the kickoff. Hopefully, thousands will come out, rally, march. But this has got to be just the beginning of the hard work of turning the tide on the neoliberal agenda in our city. QP 416 has been going door to door in neighborhoods, talking one-on-one of the dangers of privatization. I don't know if any of them have come yet to your porch. Very important, very important. They're going out to their bocce clubs, to their cricket clubs, to where they teach kids in community centers, where they, hockey coaches, talking about what it meant. Is it they or the gravy train? I don't think so. And if we look at areas across the city, the inner suburbs, whatever, Acorn is mobilizing, tenants of Toronto Community Housing, transit riders, the Jane Finch Anti-Poverty Coalition. The people are coming out tomorrow, hopefully, but this is when we understand the steelworkers. We have provided buses all over those inner suburbs, in Malvern, in Jane Finch, Lawrence and Weston, over in East York, to bring people down, community people, non-union people who are concerned about what's going on. Our own members have been going into our plants, talking to workers in lunchrooms about what's at stake, not just for public sector workers, but for all working people and the poor. And one thing that we've learned from what's happening in the fight against the austerity measures in Europe, and I've been trying to look at it a lot, is that what's going on is a process, not an event. And I think the two brothers said exactly that. And this is tremendously important. The capitalist crisis is itself protracted, and the level of fight back has to be seen on a long-term scale. There is unevenness. Walkouts and rallies are often sparked by smaller groups of workers organizing to move. You talked about it. The AFL-CIO, the Democratic Party, were not willing. And there is very often an imbalance. But where there are a number of workers prepared to take responsibility to organize in their own hands, we can see the pressure on the leadership and the pressure to put them into action. I mean, I was looking at the situation in Greece, because it's very, very interesting. I just go over a little bit. But the announcement of the cutbacks there did not bring an immediate big night of the barricades, because nothing had been just automatic or just spontaneous. Because social movements don't proceed as a whole. It's a process of building at the base with peaks and valleys, moments of surges forward, and then retreats. And the same applies to the workers' movement. The process in Greece has been a constant effort by more militant workers, sections of the workers' movement, to help others to move forward, to overcome impediments put up by the bureaucracy, as you all were saying, and provide examples of struggle that can inspire others into action. And according to a Greek worker I was talking to, and I think we all know that, the trade union leadership there is not more militant or left-wing than any other country. Most of the unions are controlled by PASOK, the equivalent of the NDP, which is elected government in October '09. The first strike was not called by trade union confederations, but by local teachers. This pressured the teacher leadership to call a limited 3-hour strike. And then there was a domino effect with other small unions, local hospital unions and others followed. The unions that made the first moves were not the biggest or the strongest, but they had a core of rank-and-file militants that had a presence of the left. And this led to the bigger strikes and showed that the fight against austerity had to be organized from below and not to have to wait for the leadership to call the actions. And the results were obvious in the general strikes that were followed, that followed up and were called by the leadership. Because the leadership could no longer simply stand aside, but start to run to catch up to the militancy. And the real difference was that in a number of workplaces, groups of workers, for the first time in a number of years anyway, felt the necessity to organize pickets and bring as many fellow workers as possible to demonstration. And the difference was in participation among different workplaces is dependent on 1, 2, 3 workers willing to take the responsibility to organize into their own hands. And then when the general strike happened, there were millions off work, hundreds of thousands in the street. But before that, there were many smaller, more fragmented actions. And this created a very complex process within the working class. And if you remember, a few years before, it was the students who showed the way forward when a 15-year-old was killed by the cops and they went into the streets. And during this process, thousands of people who weren't active before were drawn into political action. They weren't sleeping giants. They were waiting and waiting, and the time came, and they were drawn into political action by what they were seeing around them. And it's important to mention the broad participation of immigrant communities in Greece, in the general strike, in the activities. Many of them involved in precarious work, many of them not part of the official trade union movement. And that's because there was ongoing organization in those communities, organizing for their rights, building unity, building solidarity. And this was very, very crucial in stopping the scapegoating, the racism from coming to the fore, which, sometimes in a crisis, we've seen it before, can really pit people against each other instead of the real enemy. Now, when I was talking to a Greek trade unionist, he said from abroad the struggles may seem like a series of consecutive militant strikes, but inside it's very, very different. It hasn't just been a linear process. It has been a shift in consciousness of thousands of workers and students over time, a political process and an organizational challenge for trade union activists, working class activists, and socialists. And the most important challenge is to create a real network of rank-and-file trade unions, create spaces like we're seeing here in the Workers' Assembly, and build real links in the community with those who are affected by the cutbacks and privatization, and keep the pressure on the bureaucracy to lead a fight. The trade union leadership always vacillates between the interests of the members and the employers. It's a layer that's been too long from the tools, spends its time in meetings, generally prefers to dampen down militancy, and make the deal. It doesn't lose its pay or privilege during a strike or lockout, and believes that it knows best what's for the membership. Calling out the rank and file when it deems necessary, hoping they'll go back when told. But sometimes in situations like these, they are forced to mobilize, as we've seen. But the lesson must be that individual activists, men and women of color and white, must continue to learn new ways to organize so they can put pressure on the leadership rather than the other way around. So what are the implications for the situation we're facing here? When there's a left leader at the OFL, like Sid Ryan, and there's a call out for mass rally and demonstrations, then we build them. Obviously, we build them. We connect with our fellow workers, and we connect with activists in the communities in which we live, bringing people out into the streets, push back against the Ford agenda, and continue the momentum forward. But we can't wait for the leadership to move. And afterwards, after tomorrow, we have to continue to organize and build at the base in our workplaces, in our communities, on our campuses, resisting the attacks, because April 9th cannot be the end. Some people think it will be, think that's all that's necessary, or they don't want any more. And there's all kinds of reasons, I can't go into that, but there's huge discussions going on everywhere on this. But I think there's a shared and growing realization, certainly at the base, that this must be the beginning of a long and broad-based campaign. And that's why it's so important that the organizing going on for April 9th and beyond is going deep into some unions, like 416. And if people have been paying attention to what's been going on in 416, it's remarkable. And it has linked rank and file activists in those unions with groups such as ACORN, Jane Finch Anti-Poverty Coalition, the Workers' Action Center, Scarborough Civic Action Center, South Asian Women's Center, others. Talking to people in Jane Finch, as some of us have been doing about tomorrow's March and Rally, people who voted for Rob Ford, they tell you they did so with the understanding that he promised not to cut services. And it's becoming very clear that he lied, obviously. I mean, we know that from the start, but to many who voted for him. And they're not our enemies. I mean, these are the people we got to connect with. Because working class and the poor voted for Ford. That's how we got in. They thought he was going to provide accessible transit, which would cut their long rides on the Finch bus. And then he canceled the LRT. They didn't vote for him because he was going to introduce user fees in the community centers or cut library hours. They fell for his right-wing populism about elites at City Hall, supposed gravy train, as though it was the garbage worker out in every element who's living a life of luxury. So he's trying to build and cut, and I know in the steelworkers, divisions between the private sector and the public sector. He's a millionaire, you all know that. So local activists, we have to look at the strategies and tactics needed to fight effectively and ways to work independently. And there is no objective obstacle in my mind to build the kind of campaign we need, a broad-based mobilization of the labor movement and community, and not wait for the top leadership to make the call or demobilize the fight. I'm seeing new leadership, and I'm sure you are too, developing in communities across the city, uniting workers and those who provide and those who use public services. And we have to communicate a political alternative as we do our work, and dialogue with those moving into struggle. And as I said, and I'll be wrapping up here, nothing is automatic. We have to build a grassroots rank and file activism. It's so necessary. The working class activism, it requires a long-term view, and we have to continue to develop the networks in our unions, in our communities, and beyond, always drawing in new militants who want to fight. And I think, it's times like these, we're socialists, when capitalism is showing itself in all its horror, and the working people begin to look at alternatives to the market, alternatives to the system based on exploitation and oppression, and pitting one against the other. Socialists, we've got to be in the thick of the battles, rooting ourselves in our workplaces, our campuses, our communities, and linking with others, and bringing forward alternatives which can point the way forward to a society based on socialism from below. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity before us. We had one of the days of action. A number of us in the room were active then. We have another here, so let's make sure we take advantage of it and learn the lessons. Thank you very much.